So I'm going to start this one off with kind of a weird statement. You should go play this game if you haven't. Now, that's going to sound weird, especially since the very next video I'm going to be doing next week, I'm going to be saying the exact same thing. But I'm serious. I hear almost nothing about Minish Cap, and yet it's such a really, really good game. When I replayed this, I was like, I've already played this game. I know this game. I've already enjoyed this game. And yet replaying it, I was like, oh, God, it was just such a treat. It was so fun to just sit back and play it. I mean, I don't know what else to say to that. It was a huge treat. Now, it does have its flaws, most of which are in the story department, but it was just. I really am going to fail at explaining how much I enjoyed this game and how good this game was. But let's leave all that aside. Let's talk about a couple other things. For those of you who don't know, this game actually came out after Wind Waker, and it kind of shows, just like the other game in the Four Swords series, which is we're covering next week. There's a lot of obvious Wind Waker influences on this one. Sometimes with regards to the iconography, sometimes with regards to the visual style, sometimes the literal presentation of things, and in one way that'll be lore relevant that we'll talk about later. We're going to start off talking about gameplay, though. So this game, it very much is a hidden gem, just like the Four Swords Adventures game. By the way, just to make one thing really clear, because I'm going to be referring to this game in this video and in the next video, when I say Four Swords, I mean Four Swords Adventures on the GameCube. There's another game called Four Swords, which isn't really a game. It's basically a mini game, which was on the Game Boy Advance, and doesn't really have any breadth or depth to it. I'm not even covering it for the Zelda franchise. That's how irrelevant it is, okay? So when I say Four Swords, I mean the GameCube game, not the GBA thing, okay? We're all clear on that? So just like Four Swords, there you go, you got it. This is very much a hidden gem game. I know very few people. In fact, I actually only know one person who has actually played through this game, and it shows that this was another one of the ones that was made by Capcom, the same team that made the Oracle's games. Now, whatever you think of the Oracle's games, this game is, in my opinion, definitively better. This game took a lot of the essences that and the things that they did right in the Oracle's games and did it better. Just really improved upon the formula. They aren't afraid to try new things and to branch out a bit. If you ever notice, the handheld games tend to be the ones that really push the envelope when it comes to the Zelda franchise. But at least in some cases, I being one of those people who thinks that Phantom Hourglass, for example, is the most innovative of the Zelda titles. Weird thought, but there it is. But one of the things they did really weird, because the story is clearly lacking in this game, the overall aspect of story. But one thing they did right was this thing over here, setting. There's actually a lot of NPCs. I mean, a huge amount of NPCs, given the fact that there's basically 2 towns in the whole world. In fact, the overworld map itself is really small. But they were really, really efficient about their real estate, and they didn't fall into the trap of what they did back in the Oracle's games. Probably one of the things I actually disliked most about replaying through Oracle of Seasons specifically was just getting around was a hassle, at least early on when you didn't know the routes and didn't have the ability to, the items to make your way through the puzzles, basically. But in this one, the overworld still feels like an overworld, but it is very dense, for lack of a better term. No square goes unused, not square, but like no tile, no area goes unused, even though it's a ridiculously small overworld map, relatively speaking. It only has like 10 regions total. Each one of those has tons of stuff in it and tons of things to do, which brings me to my next point. This is also a game that has the least amount of dungeons, I think, ever for a Zelda game, not counting Gaiden games or things I'm not counting. So very, very few dungeons in this game. I think a grand total of 5? I could be wrong about that. It depends. I guess it depends on what you're counting as a dungeon, but very, very few dungeons, and yet each of those dungeons was long, innovative, interesting, streamlined. They introduced new mechanics. They had fun stuff to do with them. The wind, the gust thing to blow away the claws for digging. They did a lot of fun stuff with the dungeons, and again, the world. In order to kind of offset this, there's tons of stuff to do that don't involve the dungeons. It's probably the Zelda game, I think, that has the most focus away from the dungeons. And I know that's weird because Zelda Dungeons is a term and exists for a reason. But there are so many, like, side quests you can do. There's so many little explorative things you can do. There's so many little errands you can do. Just all sorts of I shouldn't say errands, like just random stuff you can do that it advances the setting. And basically nothing else. I guess it also advances characterization. Because, like I said, there's lots of NPCs all over the place in the major areas that you can go to, which add a lot of flavor to the world. And despite the fact that it's such a small world, this is the point I was leading to earlier. It makes it feel very alive, which I really really like. If anything, it makes it feel like this is a burgeoning kingdom, like one little kingdom, one town, one castle. For once, it doesn't feel small to me. Pun, haha, because it feels like this is a new kingdom, and it should. For those of you not aware, until Skyward Sword came out, this was the origin story of the Zelda franchise. This game was the beginning of the Zelda franchise. And in many ways that fits. Some would argue it fits better than Skyward Sword, but I don't want to get into that kind of a debate right here. There's a lot of little touches in the gameplay. The gameplay just shines, so I'm going to be talking about it for a bit. A lot of little touches. For example, you can roll and pick up items and move objects without having to equip anything. You don't have to equip a bracelet or get a badge or whatever. You just have to hold the R button, and you can roll innately. So it just adds to the kind of smoothness, which is actually another thing that this game does really. A lot of the game feels very, very smooth. Part of that's the animations, which are very well done. Part of that is the many options you have for transportation, like the roll I just mentioned. There's the mine cart in the one dungeon that comes to mind. What else do I have? There's the entrance warps. Two warps. There's usually two warps in each dungeon. One to like the midway point, and one to another strategic point in the dungeon, usually by the boss. So if you die, you can go back and you can use the warps to transport. It adds options. It adds more transportation options. And of course, you have the bird from. Well, effectively from LTTP, who can teleport you to all the exploration spots you found. There's what else is there? There's the oh yeah, you can skip when you transform from large to small. You can skip the animation. I know this sounds like weird things to mention, but that's what Minish Cap really is. And again, I mean no pun when I say this, but there's a lot of little things. There's a lot of little things that, when combined, make a very well executed game. It's lacking a little bit in the meat, because most of the gameplay is actually spent on the side quests, and the dungeons themselves are not that, there aren't that many of them, like I mentioned, and the plot is kind of lacking. Although it is kind of funny because the plot is a little bit different, especially since there's no Ganon. But again, I don't want to talk about story just yet. But it is extremely well executed game. The shrink mechanic is amazing in what it does to puzzle design, because they accurately represent the fact that when you're ridiculously small, things you would never even think about suddenly become huge obstacles. No pun intended again. Things that you actually have to think about overcoming. A simple hole in the ground suddenly becomes a massive chasm. A ledge that normally you would just walk on without even realizing it was there because it's just part of the background is now all of a sudden this cliff you can't surmount, and you have to find another way around. So they really did a good job with making the miniature mechanic work and really flesh out the world. There's so much you can do with that, and indeed there is so much that they did with that. Also, there's just kind of a cool factor of playing a character that is literally 3 pixels wide. I counted. You're 3 pixels wide when you're running around. And they even have a little thing, though, over your head to demonstrate where you are. So it's not irritating. You don't lose yourself. So it's like, yeah, this is cool. And, of course, when you actually go into areas where the camera zooms in on you, you can see where you are. And there's some size discrepancies, but whatever. There's still some cool stuff about that, especially given the flavor lore we get with regards to the Minish, which, again, I'll talk about later. I mentioned the mundane as the obstacle. There's a lot of really fun items in this one. This is kind of a Capcom staple, but I just dotted down a few of my favorites. The vacuum thing I already mentioned, it's actually a vacuum, not a gust thing. You suck in the stuff. You can even suck in enemies and shoot them out into walls to either stun or destroy them, which is great. What the heck does that say? There's also the digging gloves, like I just mentioned. Some of the spikes that like to rotate. That's not an item you get. That's just something that's cool. I like the idea of the fact that a couple of the enemies you fight, mini bosses and bosses both, are completely normal enemies. You just happen to be fighting them while you're shrunk, which again uses that shrinking mechanic to good effect. There's a bunch of stuff like that. I also like the idea that Zelda can, when you get to the end, there's this really cool section where Vaati is draining the life essence, kind of literally. He's pretending he's a Metroid on Zelda. If you take too long, if the third bell tolls, she dies, and it's a game over. And that's just a cool thing that instead of like in most games where you've got infinite amount of time to get there just in time, you actually have a literal timer to get there, which I actually really like that. The other thing I want to mention here is this feels like a reverse of the design philosophy of the Oracle's games. Again, same team. In the Oracle's games, if you remember me mentioning last week, I believe, each it's my timetable in real life is completely different from what you guys are saying. Each the whole world was a dungeon. The entire game was being treated as if it was a Zelda dungeon. So getting around, solving puzzles, fighting enemies everywhere was a constant thing in the Oracle's games. In here, it's like the reverse of that. Instead of everywhere feeling like a dungeon, everywhere feels like the overworld. Even when you get into the actual dungeons, you feel like you're exploring, the map. You feel like you're exploring areas that are have lots of different options, have different paths you can go, different ways to loop around. They're very well designed so that you can navigate them in multiple orders and still actually succeed at the dungeon, which again feels like an overworld. Again, that exploration thing, which they really pull off very, very well. I mentioned the animations, the dungeons, the three this is great. The three oracles from the Oracle's games are in this game. Keep in mind, this game occurs a long time before that. We're talking like centuries before that game does. And all three of them are there, and you can do a side quest to get them houses, but only two of them. The joke being the obvious fact that they couldn't actually make the third Oracle game, so you could only make the two. You see how that works out. There's a lot of silly humor in this game, too. Again, kind of a staple of the Capcom team and the handheld Zeldas in general. And I like how there's a fairly large amount of dialogue with Elzo as well. Your hat, the Minish guy. Spoiler alert, by the way. But it helps flesh things out. There's also a nice feature he has, which was actually introduced in Ocarina of Time. And I'm sorry, but I like the ability to talk to Navi, or the hat in this case, and say, what am I supposed to do? Now, I like this for several reasons. Number one, sometimes you're just blazing through it or you hit it by accident and you didn't actually catch where you're supposed to go, so you can refresh it that way. Sometimes you put the game down for a while. Sometimes you were really distracted, and when you pick it back up, you're like, what was I doing? Where was I going? So you can hit it really quick and be like, that's what I was doing. Obviously, that won't help you with side quests and stuff, but at least you have an idea of what to go for next, right? So I like that feature, especially since it's optional, unlike certain other things I could mention. So I think that's basically all I have to say about gameplay. It feels weird. I have like a page of notes here, but I just kind of blazed through it. The game is extremely well executed. I love it. It was a ton of fun to play. Let's talk about the story. Now, this game takes on new meaning. When I played through this with analysis mode and having seen Skyward Sword, that changed a lot of this game for me. If you'll notice, the Minish are not in any other games after this point in time. You'll also notice that the legend that begins this game is the idea that the Minish came down and granted this wonderful sword to the people, came down from the sky, specifically, granting them this wonderful sword in order to help them in their endeavors in the future to fight off evil. Based on the way the timelines sync up, I'm pretty sure that event happened in between Skyward and Minish. The idea here being that these Minish were, in fact, originally inhabitants of Skyloft, right? And you might be like, well, where were they in Skyloft? We didn't see them. Well, no, you wouldn't see them, would you? Although they should have put some references in there, but you know how the Zelda games are about actually referencing each other. Unless they're a direct sequel, they almost never do that. But it would have been really nice to have some kind of reference there, because I would almost put like a 90 percentile chance that the Minish actually came from Skyloft, who were denizens of that literally magical realm, a realm that defies physics and reality in order to function. And in fact, we're probably the last denizens of that, which I'll mention again when we get to Twilight Princess, but I digress. And so they're the last people. They come down because the people down on Earth are unprepared. So many of the people came down with Zelda, with Link, and were like, okay, let's make a society. Oh God, oh God, oh God. And so when the next wave of evil monsters came by, pushed forward by whomever, it doesn't matter, but the essence of demise, basically, they were unprepared for that. They had no way of dealing with it. And so that's when the Minish said, okay, no, we're going to intervene. Minish came down, gave them the power to defend themselves, helped them out with that, blah, blah, blah. Here's the weird thing. They make frequent mention of the fact that the Minish can only show up every century or so, and yet we see clearly that there are Minish who have a regular, everyday aspect of these people's lives. These people have not just been here for a few days while the doors open. These people have been here for years and will continue to be here for years. That leads me to my theory, which I postulate to you now. I think the Minish are still there in every Zelda game after this one. One of the things they mention is you cannot see a Minish unless you're a child, and even then you're not guaranteed to see them. the implication is always made that the Minish themselves are a naturally magical race, and that the more mundane people lack the ability to perceive something so innately fantastical, and that only the rare exceptions can. The idea here being that after a certain period of time, see, there's this strong emphasis, and I believe this ties into the theme of this game, of the passing of the torch, basically. The Minish helped us in our time of need, and we have built a kingdom out of that. We have built this kingdom. It's small, but it's ours. It's got castles, it's got walls, it's got commerce, it's got people. We have Gorons, we have all these, we have interactions with each other. We have a society. We have grown from the people who needed to be defended and protected. And so the Minish have both literally and metaphorically been fading from the lives of the common people, to the point where they don't really have their presence there anymore. There is still the Minish all around us, in our houses, in our in towns, hanging out, taking care of us, whatever. Because one of the things that's emphasized in the game is the Minish actively enjoy our enjoyment, the enjoyment of people. They like helping us out to do stuff. It's like, for example, the Minish who work with the tailor, or the suman, or the guy who makes boots. They work with him, and he works himself to the bone, but so they don't mind helping him out because they know it blesses him. They know he is happy to have this stuff work out. And so he just kind of assumes that he works in his sleep while he's super exhausted, when they're the ones actually doing that for him. I like that, and I like the implication that the Minish are still there doing the little stuff, again, no pun intended, while everyone else is literally incapable of noticing them, because they have simply faded so far from our field of view, literally and metaphysically. This also ties into the whole thing with Vadi himself, and this is how the theme presents itself in him. I wish Vadi was more of a character, as weird as that sounds, because he is effectively a one-note character. Before we go into that too much, though, I want to say I don't think Vadi is an expression of Demise's curse. I know the official lore completely contradicts me on that. The official lore pretty much flat out says every villain in the entire Zelda franchise is a direct result of Demise's curse at the end of Skyward. There are a few instances where I don't agree with that. The octopus thing, Balloon? I can't even remember. We'll get there. In Phantom Hourglass, Vadi, as I just mentioned, and I feel like there was another one. Thunderbird in Zelda 2, as I already mentioned my thoughts on that. I don't think those were connected to Demise at all, personally. But the main reason I don't think Vadi was connected was there's nothing connecting him to Demise other than the fact that he is a bad guy in the same franchise. That's the only connecting point. Vadi was a Minish who was curious. That was his big flaw. That was his curse, so to speak. He was curious. He wanted to know about power, and he wanted to know about the evil thoughts that lurk in people's hearts, because it was a fascinating topic to him. And that was taken to its logical conclusion when he put on the hat. The wish-granting hat, which is effectively, for all intents and purposes, a form of the Triforce. It is implied that that thing is actually powered by the Light Force, which I'll be talking about in a minute. And the idea here being that Vadi is the kind of character who would naturally go into the character arc he did. Even if he hadn't actually gotten the cap, he would still be trying to do the things he did. And he's doing it all out of ignorance, really. One of my favorite scenes is right towards the beginning of the game, where he's like, ha-ha, and now I'll open this chest and get all the power that's in it. Because he doesn't know what's in that chest. He just assumes there's power in it, because he's curious. He wants to know. And so he wants that power so he can know more. And nope, there's no power, and they're just horrible creatures. And his response is basically, well, that sucks. I'll keep looking for it. Now, this is as good a time as any to probably talk about the Light Force thing. First of all, I'd like to say I really like how they tie in the Four Swords mechanic here to create the Four Sword, the fact that we are generating the Four Sword. I also like the fact that the Four Sword is a distinctly different weapon from the Master Sword. This is not Fi. It is very clearly made clear that this weapon is not Fi. This is the one that they brought to us in order to help defend us in our time of need, and that we empower during the course of this game to become the Four Sword, which is used in Four Swords after this, both the GBA one and the GameCube one, and never else or ever again. I'm curious if the new 3DS one will involve the Four Sword in some manner. Regardless, where was I going with that? Oh, but the Four Sword, right? The Light Force. The Light Force is also pretty relevant here, because it's never mentioned anywhere else at all. The closest thing we have a reference is to the Force gems, which, thanks to some translation issues, are apparently supposed to be the Light Force gems, or whatever you want to call it. So that's it. Never mentioned anywhere else. Why is that? Why is that? Something that is considered so integral, relatively speaking, to the setting. Sadly, I've already answered this question, if you're paying attention. One of the biggest themes of this is the passing of the torch. Remember, there's no Triforce in Four Swords. There's no golden power. And yet what we do have is this light force, this energy power that is passed down through the generations of the people who are blessed by the Hylia, or I can't remember, the goddess chick, whose name I can't remember, from Skyward Sword, which is passed down through the Zeldas, right? So that light force is personified and being protected in and used by her in order to, accomplish the various things she wants to accomplish. It is very likely and indeed possible that that just kind of fades over time, just like everything else does about the Minish magic. As the Minish themselves fade from history's view and fade from the reality of the rest of the people, that very force fades from it. But that force needed to be there because it was the crawling before we walk. We don't have a Triforce. We don't have the Master Sword. We don't have anything. So the Minish came in and said, we'll take care of you for a little bit. Long enough for you to get on your own feet and to get to the next step. Because what's the next game in the timeline? Ocarina. What happens after Ocarina? The Triforce, in various forms, comes into the possession of the kingdom. Granted, that's not quite what happened in the Wind Waker timeline, but you know what I mean. And therefore the kingdom would then start focusing on the three goddesses and the Triforce, and their whole focus would change from this light force thing, which was already fading and might not have even been usable at that point, to this new thing, revering the Triforce instead. Which makes sense to me. The one other thing I want to mention, though, I said how we don't ever see the Minish again after this point. What if we do? Bear with me on this. We have seen in the Zelda franchise that it is possible through severe magical alteration that a species can basically fundamentally change into another one. This is, if it's been argued that this has happened a few times, but it is fundamentally, absolutely put down that this happened in Wind Waker, right? With the species whose name I don't remember, but they used to be the Zora, right? So that's a thing that we know is happening. I postulate that there is another, magically inclined, young, innocent race that doesn't age, that is integrally tied into the land and the forest, and they're Kokiri. I'm saying the Minish are Kokiri, or vice versa. I don't know if they're in alteration, or I don't know if they're a certain group of Minish that kind of separated and went to do their own thing, because there are two groups of Minish in the Minish Cap. There's the ones who are in their forest, completely off doing their own thing, and there's the ones in the town who are trying to interact with people, and they are considered completely separate cultural and societal groups. For all intents and purposes, they are different races, if not different species, if you understand the distinction. So it's logical to me that this group who stayed with the people would slowly acclimate, either magically or otherwise, to being more capable of interacting with them, which eventually led to them becoming something like the Kokiri, or that the reverse happened, and this happened to the ones in the forest because of their desire to do the same thing that the town ones were doing, but the ones in the forest couldn't because of, you couldn't leave the forest, all that fun stuff, because it was inherently tied to who and what they were. I don't know how the Deku Tree ties into this. Maybe the Deku Tree is actually the fundamental force that enabled them in order to become the larger Kokiri, rather than the really, really dinky Minish. And you're going to tell me I'm stupid and horrible, and that's fine. I'm okay with that. Because I honestly think this. It makes a lot of sense for me. And kind of helps tie that in a little bit, especially given what then happens in Wind Waker. And to a lesser extent in Twilight Princess, but I don't want to get that in here. So yeah, I've already kind of talked about the big things, the themes, the humans being left to their own affairs, the idea of the magical, passing of the torch kind of a thing. But one of the things I want to mention as well is the origin story thing. I said I'd get back to that. Again, until Skyward came out, this was the origin story of the entire Zelda franchise. Do you think that's better or worse? And I ask you genuinely. Because what we had with the Skyward thing is, okay, here is the origination of the Master Sword, because the Four Sword is clearly not the Master Sword. So Fi and the origin of the Master Sword, that's the actual definitive origination of that. It shows how the world basically began. It shows the beginning of the cycle, which has been repeated many, many times throughout the franchise, with Demise, with Link, and with Zelda. The three aspects, it kind of adds a few other things, lore-wise, to the overall franchise, but that's kind of it, really. By contrast, Minish Cap doesn't really add much of anything. And I know that sounds weird, but at the same time, Minish Cap, in my opinion, I'm just going to go ahead and give my opinion. I think Minish Cap is a better origin story for Zelda. Why? Because it feels more like an origin story. Skyward feels like it was trying to be an origin story. Minish Cap feels like it succeeds. Remember everything I mentioned before? It's a smaller world, a weaker kingdom, less advanced, less people, still dependent on the old ways, still just starting to discover the new ways. That all felt like the beginnings of Hyrule. Minish Cap actually felt like we were peeking into the past and seeing this is what Hyrule used to be. Skyward Sword had none of that feeling for me when I was playing it. It had none of that implication throughout the game. So this is one of the reasons I postulate this thing. I'm not saying Skyward Sword doesn't deserve to exist. Some people would say that. And I'm not playing the game again. Stop asking. I'm not going to play it again for this Rumination series. I guess that's actually all I've got. I'm sorry. Some of these are going to be kind of short, especially the handheld games. It's funny because it takes so long to play through them. And then I sit down and talk for 20 minutes or however long it's been. But I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you go play this game. Next week, we're talking about a game that you've probably never played. And some of you have probably never even heard of. I've actually streamed this game a little bit, so we'll be talking about Four Swords. That is to say, Four Swords Adventures, the GameCube one, next week. I will see you then.